Why do Catholics need to understand Mormonism? Today on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of Saint Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Dr. Francis Beckwith. He is a professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Baylor University. Among his many books are The New Mormon Challenge and Taking Rites Seriously, Law, Politics, and the Reasonableness of Faith. He also edited with Dr. Richard Sherlock the book we're going to be discussing today, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. It's published by Ignatius Press. Ignatius.com is where you can find it. Dr. Francis Beckwith, welcome to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a great blessing to have you with us. So tell us about your 2002 book, The New Mormon Challenge, and why there was a need for this new book, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints.
That's a great question. And so back in the late 1990s, when I was a much younger professor of philosophy, I was approached by two young seminary students, evangelicals, not non-Catholics, who had an interest in Mormonism as a point of research for their theological work, and which is it's unusual because very few people work in that area who aren't themselves Mormons. I had published a couple of years earlier a small book called The Mormon Concept of God, a Philosophical Analysis. And they had read it, and they said, you're the only person that we know of that has taken Mormonism seriously, did not engage in rhetorical flourishes, treated Mormons with respect, even though we were critical. And so these two young men, Carl Mosier and Paul Owen, invited we got together and put together a list of scholars that we subsequently invited to contribute to this book, dealing with serious theological, biblical, and philosophical issues that divided sort of conventional Christians and Mormons. Now, at the time, I had not returned to the Catholic Church. I had left the Catholic Church as a youngster and considered myself an evangelical. And that book we were very proud of. It got a lot of attention. We had two BYU professors endorse the book, even though they didn't agree with our conclusions, because we tried our best to engage them with respect. Fast forward almost nearly 15 years later, I returned to the Catholic Church, or actually 5 years later. I, at the time, was president of the Evangelical Theological Society. I went to confession for the first time in 30 years, and a week after that, resigned as president of ETS. My friend, Richard Sherlock, who just recently retired as professor of philosophy at Utah State, 5 years later became Catholic. He had grown up Mormon and had been Mormon all his life. And so Richard approached me. He said, we should put together a Catholic version of the New Mormon Challenge. And so that's the sort of history of the book. Much of what I did with the New Mormon Challenge, even though it is all the contributors are evangelicals, we defend in that book mostly doctrines that Catholics would agree with. But then there are specific things about Catholicism that Protestants part ways with. And so in this book, we try to focus on those issues.
Yes. Yeah, great. Again, the book, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. You can get it at ignatiuspress.com, the publisher. And in this book, a collection of Catholic scholars who address several theological topics over which Mormons and Catholics hold contrary beliefs: the great apostasy, the papacy, the Eucharist, the Trinity, the incarnation, the nature of God, justification, sainthood, liturgy, and deification. And the introduction lays out some of the basics of Mormonism. Can you share some of those basic points now for Catholics who may be completely unfamiliar with the LDS?
Sure. So the Mormon Church begins in the early 19th century. It begins with a young man who's living in upstate New York named Joseph Smith Jr. This is his story. He claims that there were so many differing religious groups in his area of the country. He didn't know which one to join, so he prayed and asked God to give him wisdom based on what he had read in the book of James in the Bible, in which it says, if any of you needs wisdom, ask of God. So he did, and he claims to have been visited by God the Father, God the Son, and a host of angels that told him not to join any religions, but that inevitably he would receive further information about what he later calls the restoration of the gospel. And eventually he is given, again, this is his story, golden plates by an angel named Moroni. And these golden plates are what he says he translates into what is the Book of Mormon, which is a account, according to Smith, of Jesus after his resurrection coming to North America to preach the gospel to the people here. And so Joseph Smith winds up attracting numerous followers. He begins with maybe a dozen in 1830 when the founding of the church is established, and it grows enormously. And over time, Joseph Smith claims to receive even further revelation from God, and this is where the Mormon Church starts being very different in its theology from traditional Nicene Christianity. When I use the term Nicene Christianity, I'm referring to those beliefs that we can historically point to in the Council of Nicaea, which is shared by Catholics, Orthodox, and many Protestant groups. And so what Smith winds up saying in several of his sermons, and becomes part of LDS doctrine, that God actually has a physical body like we do, and that God had once been a man like us on another planet who eventually was exalted into godhood by obeying the same principles that he's now imparting to us through the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so it's grown enormously over the last nearly now 200 years. The Mormon Church is one in which the sorts of activities they engage in, the charitable works, in many ways are worth emulating. We focus on the doctrines in the book, but that is kind of in a nutshell the history of kind of a brief history and a little bit about their doctrine. Certainly would love to explore more.
Sure. Yeah. As we get into the doctrine, the topics of doctrine that are in the book, just wondering, I guess, from a research perspective, since you've, for many years you've tackled this subject in both of these books that you've been a part of. So, I guess just wondering, is it easy to access information to really get to what the doctrines of the Latter-day Saints are? I have a little bit of experience with them, not much. I remember on a mission trip I was on in Hawaii at one point, a big, I don't know if you call it a Mormon temple or whatever it is, but I remember levels, and you go up these levels, and we went as far as we could, and you meet people, and they say you can't come in here, you can't go any farther, and sort of a secretiveness was the sense of it. We tried to ask them some questions. They didn't seem very forthcoming, unfortunately. So I'm just wondering, in the research, like, do they have something like equivalent to, we have a Catholic catechism, somebody could go and learn all about our doctrines. Do they have something similar where all the doctrines are laid out and you can go and read them?
Yeah, great question. There really isn't one authoritative document like the Catholic Catechism, although there have one of the things about the Mormon faith that is quite remarkable is that they document everything. There are easily accessible resources, largely having to do with their approach to genealogy. So something the Mormons believe in is called baptism of the dead. And so you can literally baptize relatives that had predeceased you generations ago and be baptized for them on their behalf, right? And so part of their culture has been this kind of relentless research and documentation, which I think comes out of their their genealogical research. So it's sometimes one of the difficulties with Mormon doctrine is that if you get on their website, there's a lot of explanations for their beliefs, and they're very candid about it. But if you get into sort of the Mormon scholarship, one of the things that comes out is that LDS scholars themselves debate about what constitutes sort of the final way to think about the Mormon view of, let's say, God. So let me give you an illustration. I mentioned earlier that in sort of kind of boilerplate Mormon doctrine, God was once a man like us and lived on a world and developed into God. Some Mormon scholars say, well, that's kind of mysterious. We're not sure Joseph Smith is saying that God was never God. So what you find is a kind of way of dealing with difficult passages that's actually parallel to the way some sort of conventional Christians deal with difficult passages.
Interesting. All right. Yeah, a lot to get into here with Dr. Francis Beckwith. Again, the book is called A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. A lot of fascinating information in here. Ignatius.com, published by Ignatius Press, Ignatius.com. And yeah, maybe you've had the experience of running into a member of LDS. They're very enthusiastic to be missionary and to share some of the basics and try to draw people in. They have stands. I encounter them in parks sometimes and different things. But it's good to know, what do they actually believe? What does their doctrine say? How does it differ? We're going to get into more when we get back. Stay tuned.
iCatholic Mobile is a proud sponsor of the Station of the Cross. Solid connections, reliable data. That's iCatholic Mobile, a 5G wireless provider dedicated to your faith and values. Enjoy unlimited talk and text, dependable coverage nationwide. And every plan has unlimited data and free roaming in Canada and Mexico. iCatholic Mobile, the service that connects you to what matters most. More info at iCatholicMobile.com.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Francis Beckwith. He is an editor on this new book, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints, that you can get at Ignatius Press. Ignatius.com is where you can find it, or wherever you find books. You can find this one as well. But this is many different scholars writing different chapters in this book. Dr. Beckwith, he wrote chapter 3 of this book. Also, chapter 7 co-wrote that one. Chapter 7 is on Catholicism, Mormonism, and Eucharistic realism. But first, I want to get back into chapter 3, and this is entitled Classical Theism, Latter-day Saint Theism, and a long-awaited, though modest, rejoinder to the Roberts-Vander Donk debate. So big title there, but we'll break it open. So let's spend some time there. You write about how both the LDS and the Catholic teaching on the nature of God are radically different. You were sharing a little bit with us in that first segment, classical theism versus Latter-day Saint theism. Break this open a bit more for us. What else is most important for us to know here?
Sure. So let me explain the title, because you mentioned the long title, and the title it's something I'd wanted to do for quite a while. So back in the early 20th century, there was a self-taught LDS scholar named B.H. Roberts, who had been an immigrant from England, came to the United States, illiterate, taught himself multiple languages, was converted to Mormonism. In the early 20th century, he debated a Jesuit priest in Pocatello, Idaho, who was the pastor of a Catholic church in Pocatello. And his name was I forgot how do you pronounce it? Vander Donk. And this guy, they debated each other in publicly, and then it was transcribed. B.H. Roberts has the opening salvo, Father Vander Donk the rebuttal, but then B.H. Roberts has the last word, and the debate ends. So what I'm doing here is giving, on behalf of Father, I am coming in to defend him against B.H. Roberts' rebuttal. But what are the differences? So the classical theism, or what is sometimes called the classical Christian or classical Catholic view of God, is that God is a self-existent, simple, eternal, all-powerful being that has underived existence. That is to say, everything in the universe that's created has derived existence. Everything, us, the stars, the planets, dogs and cats, all that stuff. God has underived existence. And then to say that God is simple means that God doesn't have parts like we do. So I could lose a part and still be me, whereas God is always a perfect whole. Now we think of God because our language is this way. We say that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and so forth. But God, in his very essence, is not divided in that way. It isn't like he could lose his omnipotence and still be God, like I can lose my hand and still be me. So the Mormon view is that God is not only is God not simple, in that he does have parts, but God is also in time. And that God is not a Trinity, that there are three beings called Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they are not, as we say in the Creed, consubstantial with each other. They aren't the same substance. They're three different things. Now there is a Trinity for the Mormons, but it's only a Trinity insofar as the three members of the Trinity share the same purpose or ends. They're kind of united like members of a committee would be united. So that's radically different. It's in a way you could say that in the Mormon universe, God is ultimately not the creator of everything that is. In some sense, he's a creature like us. And then in a sense, the universe kind of pre-exists God himself. Even if God is as eternal as the universe, whatever the universe is made out of, God is merely a craftsman that takes the materials that have always existed and makes what he wants. This is why, by the way, about 25 years ago, the Vatican had to deal with a question that had been raised to the doctrinal office about whether the church would accept converts from Mormonism without having to rebaptize them. And the doctrinal office concluded that they had to be rebaptized because when an LDS minister or bishop baptizes someone in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they don't mean the exact same thing as, let's say, Presbyterians or Methodists may mean. And that's why if somebody converts to Catholicism from a mainline Protestant group, those baptisms are generally almost universally accepted.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. So that's important to know, right? And so, yeah, this is where it's difficult for me sometimes when I do try to engage with Mormons that are out in the park, trying to draw people in, talk to them, share information, because I really like your approach. I think that's the right way, to be very charitable and generous and respectful and serious. And we don't want to build up straw men and knock them down and all that. But sometimes it seems to me that at least the people I've encountered out there, they try to draw people in by using Christian language, Catholic language, to relate, without telling them that actually, though, when I'm using the word Trinity, I mean something quite different. When I say Jesus is God, I mean something quite different. He's a God. He's not the God. They're not monotheistic, right? And so everything is very different here. Also not believing that God really, as you were saying, not really the first cause of things, saying the universe is really the first cause. So to me, I guess my question would be, that's a complete redefinition of I think what we would say, what we would believe about God, because then he's not God at all, actually, because that's what it means to be God, that he is that first cause. He does create out of nothing. There is one God, and all of the things you're saying about being simple and all of that. So they really sort of believe that the universe, I guess, would be God in a sense, don't they?
Yeah, there is a sense in which that's the case. Now, one of the things I've seen over the past 20 or 30 years is that there are one thing about encountering Mormon friends. You mentioned your own experience. I'm not sure that sort of ordinary Mormon is that interested in the sort of finer points of theology. And so it may be that for some of them, they don't even recognize the differences. And that sounds kind of odd, but if you look at the way in which the Latter-day Saints sort of arise in American history and how successful they've been, they are a remarkably pragmatic and practical people that have done amazingly in terms of education, business, medicine. In fact, I think of all American religious groups, and it's been a while since I've checked these stats, I think only Jewish Americans exceed them in terms of education and earning higher degrees and so forth. So I think there's something about the Latter-day Saint culture where those sorts of questions just aren't as important to them. And there's also this other phenomenon, and that is that a lot of the converts to Mormonism, especially in the United States, are people that have a kind of vague understanding of Christianity from their own upbringing. So if, let's say, somebody who grew up in a nominal Catholic family or a nominal evangelical family or Presbyterian or Methodist, what happens is that they will kind of involuntarily reinterpret Mormonism in light of their own experience. And so I always wonder whether the sort of ordinary rank and file LDS are just, they're not as interested in that. But having said that, though, I do think one of the things that I've seen over the past 20 or 30 years, which I was beginning to say earlier, and that is that there are many LDS intellectuals that have gone on to, let's say, do graduate work in philosophy or theology at places like Duke and Stanford and Harvard and Yale and places like that. And what for the first time in their lives, they encounter the riches of the Christian tradition. They begin reading people like Augustine and Aquinas, and some of them reading the Protestant reformers, and they begin they start to actually try to incorporate or appropriate much of traditional Christianity to, in a way, kind of reinterpret Mormonism. So about 30 years ago, there was this movement was labeled by a Mormon sociologist Mormon neo-orthodoxy. And so you find even in the LDS world, a kind of ambivalence about how to properly interpret these seemingly literalistic claims about God that Joseph Smith and others assert. Now, my own view is that the right way to interpret them is that Joseph Smith, in fact, did really mean it that way, that he was speaking literalistically and that he was offering a radically different understanding of God. But if LDS scholars are able to move their church closer to traditional Christianity, then who am I to suggest that they not do that? So, I mean, I would rather have them move in that direction, and in that sense, it would be easier to, invite them to consider Catholicism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the nature of God, radically different. Also, the nature of human beings, really radically different in the sense that says here the spirits of human beings, this is their view, the spirits of human beings have pre-existed in some form from all eternity and are thus uncreated intelligences. What more, I guess, can you share with us about that doctrine? That's a pretty big radical difference.
Yeah, so it's kind of mysterious, and I'll explain why. That there's also some passages in Mormon literature that says that our spirit selves, that is, our pre-existent, that pre-incarnate selves, were actually the result of God's own procreative activity with his wife. So but yet there's also, as you cite, quote from the book, there's also this aspect in some Mormon literature by leaders saying that we are pre-existent intelligences as well, in the sense we've always existed in this kind of almost primordial essences that are kind of, hanging about the universe. And so I've tried in the introduction to reconcile those in some way, saying that our pre-existent birth is a means by which these intelligences are given a kind of cognitive life.
Right. Yeah. Very, very interesting. It's very odd, but yes, we want to take a serious approach to this. I really appreciate that in this text to try to lay out, okay, what are the real beliefs here? What are the differences? Let's get a good, honest look at it. Again, the book is A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. We're talking to Dr. Francis Beckwith today. You can get the book anywhere you find books, especially good Catholic books, but Ignatius Press is the publisher. Ignatius.com. You can certainly find the book there, Ignatius.com. We're going to be back with more with Dr. Francis Beckwith. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Francis Beckwith, talking about A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints, a great book you can find at Ignatius.com. And just, I guess, a little bit more in this chapter on classical theism, and then also the doctrine of LDS, this Latter-day Saints sort of understanding of the nature of God. And look, if you get the nature, it seems to me, if you get the nature of God wrong, if you get the Holy Trinity wrong, if you get the nature of man wrong, you're going to get a whole lot of other things wrong as well. I think that's true, but also that almost is kind of amazing that there would be agreement, though, on various moral teachings and different things. So it's not that everything is in disagreement with our Mormon friends, but there are some big things and some really foundational things. And so the nature of God is one here I just want to spend a little bit more time on, and that is that, as we've already stated, so there's not a belief in the Trinity as three persons in one God, as we would hold it, but rather they will say they believe in the Trinity, but the truth of it is their understanding of the Trinity is of three separate gods, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and that we spoke a little bit about the origin story that they have about God the Father, that he was a man like us and then became God as he is, just as their belief that man can become God. And there's a sense of this, but it's different in Catholic teaching, deification or divinization. We don't mean the same thing, but then there's also, you write here in this chapter on the classical theism, you write about the origin and nature of God the Son and the Holy Ghost being a bit more mysterious for them, and even saying here that for Jesus, they would say, prior to his incarnation, he was like all human beings, a premortal spirit, child of the Father, though he is unique insofar as he was the Father's firstborn spirit child. He is also unique in another way. Unlike all other human beings, Christ's physical existence was directly brought about by God the Father with the Virgin Mary's cooperation. But whether this divine siring involved literal conjugal relations between God the Father and the Virgin Mary is a matter of dispute among contemporary LDS scholars and authorities. Some believe it was literal, while others claim it was shrouded in mystery, and one ought not speculate about its precise meaning. So this is where sometimes differences in doctrine become very, very difficult, because it's quite offensive, right, to say these things when we hold these things with such reverence and love. And so trying to say, well, they don't understand it the way we do. Maybe no one's ever shared it with them. We've got to give them a little room here. But at the same time, I think if we do have Mormon friends, these are good matters, I think, to try to speak to and say, this is a bit offensive here. Here's why. Let me share with you what we know about the nature of our Lord Jesus, about the Virgin Mary and how this all works. But any other wisdom that you can share with us on this?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that, just from studying Mormonism for so many decades now, that and I didn't realize this when I was an evangelical, but I'm more appreciative about this than ever, and that is that in some ways Mormonism is kind of Protestantism on steroids. And what I mean by that is that it takes the view of sola scriptura and kind of takes it out of church history. And so you just read the Bible in almost a hyper-literalistic way. So when it, for example, in the book of Genesis, when it says that God walked with Adam in the garden, they read it as, well, that must mean that he has legs, right? Because he walked with Adam. Whereas even traditional Protestants would not read it that way, right? Because they're still, in a sense, within that tradition that sees the divine nature as being outside of time, simple, and so forth. And then with the issue of Mary and the virgin birth, that I think the reason why I think recent Mormon presidents have said that it's shrouded in mystery is precisely because of what you suggested. There is something that comes across as deeply offensive about that. The idea that God the Father had literal conjugal relations with Mary. So I don't know if I've had some friends say to me, I'm not sure what I'm going to say is accurate in terms of my own sort of take on Mormonism, but it's something that I have floated with friends like Richard, that in some ways Mormonism is kind of like Protestantism's Islam. That is, the way Islam comes out of 8th century or 7th century Catholicism, or sort of actually Eastern Christianity, but it was before the Great Schism. In some ways, Mormonism sort of comes out of a kind of late Protestantism, but takes it to like a higher level. But at the same time, there's almost a kind of religious genius about Smith, even though I think Joseph Smith wasn't really a prophet. There's the fact that he also sees the need to have apostolic succession. So he claims that he and a friend of his were visited by Peter, James, and John, who laid hands on them in order for them to receive the priesthood. So there you've got in Mormonism a kind of this odd combination of biblical literalistic fundamentalism, a kind of hyper-Protestantism, and also a very high view of human nature. So there's very little talk about original sin or the role that suffering plays in the development of one's character and the virtues. Like, Catholics are accustomed to talking that way, right? We're accustomed to saying if we're undergoing some sort of burden or suffering, I remember my grandmother saying this, offer it up. Right, but that kind of thinking is not you don't find that within the LDS world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, no, I really appreciate your thoughts. And one of the things I guess that would certainly come across as offensive to them, but I guess I have to raise it as something that seems like a very reasonable possibility, and that is that the whole origin story with Joseph Smith, and you saying, look, there's a certain intelligence here, a certain brilliance to this in a way, even though it's twisted. I mean, would you say that there's some reason to perhaps consider that maybe some of this origin story is in fact demonic in the way that he sort of lays it out, saying that he's having these encounter with angels or spirits, and what if these are evil spirits or fallen angels? Any thought to that?
Yeah, so it's something that I've thought about, but as a philosopher, I kind of wanted to put that on the back burner, in terms of addressing some of these issues. But I think that's something that would be perfectly okay for somebody to entertain and to investigate. What's interesting is in the past couple of years there's been a kind of renewal within the wider Christian world about how the modern way of looking at the universe has resulted in our thinking about things in a disenchanted way, and that we actually live in a lot more of an enchanted universe than modernism has, thought. And so, I think you find, among recent writers on these issues of demonic activity and the spiritual world, I think there's a lot more talk about it. But, in terms of the strategy for the book, it was something that, Richard and I, we talked a little bit about, should we include questions about, that deal with Smith's character, or whether these visits from, other world beings are demonic, and we decided not to address it. But I think it'd be perfectly okay for someone to do that. We just didn't want that to factor into our project.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, just laying out sort of what the beliefs are, the differences, a clear look at this. Very important. And so anything else from chapter 3, specifically, I guess, anything regarding the rejoinder that you were able to get in here on the debate, anything you want to add in here?
Yeah, I think that B.H. Roberts, despite his brilliance, just got a lot of things wrong about the classical Christian doctrine of God. There's a lot of it that I think has to do with just a lack of imagination and a lack of acquaintance with the way in which classical Catholic scholars talk about the doctrine of God. And one thing that I think that B.H. Roberts totally loses, and I think even today, even some sort of traditional Christians who defend views of God that I think are not orthodox, is that when someone like an Aquinas or an Augustine or even the church itself in its catechism describes God with using obviously our language, that language is to be understood analogically. That is to say, when we say, for example, that God is wise, we mean that God is, obviously he has wisdom, but his wisdom is not like our wisdom. Any wisdom that we may have bears a similarity, but his is so far greater than ours that the best we can do is to use language in a way that's analogous, but not univocal. Univocal means exactly the same thing. And so one of the things that Roberts does is he uses language. He thinks that when Catholics talk about God being three persons, the church means it in the same way when we say that there are three persons at the park bench, or something like that. And it's not. So I think one of the things that again, despite B.H. Roberts' brilliance, and I admire his being self-taught, I think he just doesn't really get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you also co-wrote the chapter Catholicism, Mormonism, and Eucharistic Realism. What would you like to share with us from that chapter?
Yeah, so that was co-authored with my colleague Alex Pruce, who's a philosophy professor here at Baylor, and there we try to situate the Mormon view of the Eucharist within the wider Christian world. And so we first conclude that their view of the Eucharist is purely symbolic, and although they celebrate it at every Sunday service, and they call it the sacrament, and they have bread and grape juice. They don't drink fermented wine. And their view, what we do is we do two things. We first situate their doctrine within the sort of the Protestant resistance to the Catholic doctrine, but then we explain the origins of the Catholic doctrine, why it's biblical, and why Catholics use words like transubstantiation to explain it. And we make a case that if as far back as you go in church history, whenever a church father talks about the Eucharist, they always use realist language. That is, they use language that when describing the Eucharist, that they really believed it was the body and blood of Christ, even long before the church started using language like transubstantiation. So we try to show in the chapter, where the Mormons fit in terms of their view, and then why the Catholic view is in fact a plausible view, and why it's really the one that we believe is the most historically established.
Absolutely. Great chapter 7 in the book. And the book is called A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. We're talking with Dr. Francis Beckwith, one of the editors on the book, and also wrote a chapter and co-wrote another chapter here. And again, there are many scholars who have written chapters in this book covering many theological topics over which Mormons and Catholics hold contrary beliefs. The great apostasy, the papacy, the Eucharist, the Trinity, the incarnation, the nature of God, justification, sainthood, liturgy, and deification. We'll get into more when we get back with Dr. Francis Beckwith. Find out which of those topics would he like to help us to understand more about the contrary beliefs between Mormons and Catholics, and how understanding that can be beneficial to us. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Dr. Francis Beckwith, discussing the book, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. You can get it at ignatiuspress.com, ignatiuspress.com. Actually, just Ignatius.com, published by Ignatius Press, Ignatius.com. All right, final segment here. Down the stretch we go. Dr. Beckwith, what else? A lot of different topics still that we have not had time to cover in this book. What do you think is most important, or what would you like to deal with while we still have some time here?
Yeah, so there's some really outstanding chapters by some great Catholic scholars. Let me just mention briefly, discuss a few of them. One is the great Matthew Levering. I don't know if your listeners are aware of Matthew Levering's work. He teaches at Mundelein Seminary right outside of Chicago. He is one of the great contemporary Catholic scholars, and we were ecstatic that he agreed to contribute to the volume. His chapter is on the Trinity, and he does a really nice job of explaining both the biblical and historical development of the idea of the Trinity, showing that the earliest Christians believed in it, even before it was fully articulated at the Council of Nicaea, and shows how the Mormon view of the Trinity differs remarkably from that view. That chapter, I think most of the chapters, even when they're not intentionally trying to do it, show the continuity between the early church and the current Catholic Church. And that's an important point to make, because according to the Mormon story, that there was a great apostasy after the first generation after the apostles. That is to say, Christianity vanished entirely from the earth, and it required a restoration. And so one of the I think one of the most important aspects of these chapters is that they, in one way or another, show that there is that these ideas that are attributed to Catholicism are not recent. They're not beliefs that were invented at Vatican II or Vatican I, or after the Reformation of the Council of Trent, or by St. Thomas Aquinas or Boethius or Augustine. No matter how far back you go, you find even in the most primitive versions of these doctrines, they may be underdeveloped, but they're in continuity with them. Now, having said that, we actually do have a chapter on the Great Apostasy, and that is written by the great St. Louis University historian James Hitchcock, and he deals in that chapter with a popular book written by a Mormon writer named James Barker, who makes a case for the Great Apostasy. And even though Barker wasn't an established LDS scholar, his work is so prevalent in the LDS world in popular circles, we thought it would be wise to ask Professor Hitchcock to do an analysis of the book, and it's almost like an historical version of surgery. He goes through and sort of shows at every point where Barker, presents or misunderstands a particular shift in the history of the church. And so that I think, as I said, in different ways, the chapters kind of make that make an implicit case for to doubt the great apostasy. Now we have a chapter by Ronald Thomas, a Catholic theologian, on the papacy, and again that's a chapter that makes a case for the continuity of the papacy from the very earliest days of the church, and shows how it has served the church in amazing ways, even when there have been in history not such virtuous popes. And so Thomas does there is a continuity aspect to that chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, phenomenal. Yeah, I mean, it really is something of a resource that is good for really for anybody that is serious about looking at faith in general, because it's not just something that, give it to your Mormon friend and it kind of shows him, the where he's missing things or whatever. Look, this is great for Protestant friends as well as Catholic friends. We need to know the truths that are being unpacked here and traced historically, and to really understand that this is real. Jesus and his Catholic Church are real, and I think that argument is very well shown and said throughout this book. Anything else you want to share with us today?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned about the book being a resource just to understand Catholicism. So even if you're not interested in Mormonism, each of the chapters in one way or another defends a vital aspect of Catholic doctrine. So you can sort of ignore the Mormon parts in the sense, where the authors bring in the LDS views. So one chapter I hadn't mentioned yet is by Joel Barstad, who's an Eastern Rite Catholic priest, called Mormon Pelagianism. So he talks about the role that grace plays in conversion, and how within the Christian world there's always been this temptation to bring in our own power, or to think that we are in some way the primary catalyst for our own salvation. And he thinks that the Latter-day Saint theology is an exaggerated version of acquiescing to that temptation. But in the chapter, Father Barstad does a really nice job of explaining how grace works in conversion, how it moves the will, and how that will, when moved by the Holy Spirit and God's grace, allows one to assent, and then with that sanctifying grace participate in the divine life and cooperate for the transformation of ourselves to be in the image of his Son. So that's it's, even though again focusing on Mormonism, but there's a larger question there that I think is important for Catholics who are interested in what it means to be truly converted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about the topic that is so important, I guess, to Mormons, deification, and the fact is that you can find church fathers talking about that. We become like God through divinization or deification, but it's very different than the Mormon understanding.
That's right. So there are church fathers, in fact, even the Catholic Catechism, quoting one of the Petrine epistles, that we can participate in the divine nature. And that just simply means that by God's grace, we can be transformed and eventually able to see God in his essence. And in that sense, we participate in the divine nature. Now, the LDS view is that we literally become gods. And, the LDS will sometimes cite some of those fathers, but the scholars generally know that is not an accurate presentation of those early views. In fact, about 15 years ago now, I was invited to speak at a conference on Mormonism and American politics at Princeton, and I had lunch with 4 or 5 LDS scholars, and they started talking about deification, and they kind of forgot that I was there. And one of them was talking about the church fathers, and one of the other scholars, a professor, I believe at the University of Virginia, a very renowned historian who happened to be Mormon, and he said, we can't use those fathers to establish our view. And it was great. I mean, I actually thanked them after lunch for allowing me to sort of be privy to this sort of internal fraternal conversation. And so, yeah, it's a completely different view of deification.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, great book, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. Again, Ignatius.com is where you can find it, Ignatius.com. Dr. Francis Beckwith, incredible. Yeah, great work. Really appreciate you coming on. And anything else you want to share with us, anything else to plug today that you want people to know about?
Yeah, so if they're interested in more of my work, I have a website, francisbeckwith.com, and there's access to articles and links to some of the books.
All right, wonderful. francisbeckwith.com. And if you have any questions, comments on the show, you can always reach out to me, Jim H. at thestationofthecross.com. But highly recommend the book. Again, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints, a resource for any Catholic serious about learning more about their faith, Ignatius.com. God bless you all.